you hear me okay? Okay. Mic check, 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 check. All right. That's hilarious. Very nice. Okay. So, I guess we should go ahead and get started since it's 1/4 after. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. So, my name is Jon Reid, and I work with a company called EffectiveUI here in Denver. Our company, we work with our clients to help them build software that is focused on user adoption. So what we try and do is work very closely with the users to figure out what they actually need to do in addition to what our clients' business goals are, and produce software that actually helps meet both of those. So for us, accessibility is a very important topic, and so we're very happy to be here today to talk about this stuff. What I want to talk about today is a little bit different, I think, than some of the other topics that are going to be covered here. In particular, I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about at this conference is about the specifics of accessibility, the technologies involved, the theory behind it, and so forth. I'd like to talk about taking that information and applying it in a business context, because a lot of times accessibility falls by the wayside when you start dealing with those situations. And based on my experience, that isn't necessary. You can actually do all of this stuff without any trouble. So, so that you guys know why you should listen to me about this, like I said, I work for EffectiveUI, where I'm a senior developer. I lead up the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript development practice there. And throughout my career, I've always been focused on the user interface. It's been really, really important to me. HTML in particular has been something that I've worked a great deal with. And I've worked in a lot of different business situations. I've worked in a lot of agencies. So EffectiveUI is a user experience agency. I've also worked at Crispin, Porter & Boguski, which is one of the top advertising agencies in the country, where I worked with brands like Microsoft and Volkswagen, stuff like that. And I worked with another local company called Texture Media, which was an online branding agency, where we worked with companies like Midas, Celestial Seasoning, stuff like that. I've also worked in specific business situations. So I've done work with a company called Core Business Solutions, where I helped them build their document management software. And I worked with Western Union as an example. I helped them build out the user interface for their money transfer system and stuff like that. And I've also worked in scientific situations. So at Genomica, I helped build out the user interface for the genetic analysis software that we were working on. And way back in the beginning of my career, I started out at the Joint Institute of Laboratory Astrophysics, where I was building software that basically visually modeled fusion reactors. So I have a lot of experience with this. And like I said, I've always been attracted to the user interface. It's always been something that's been very important to me. And my focus has been mostly in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about mostly in my context here. But I think the stuff that I have to talk about applies in a much broader context. So what I've noticed in my experience, when you start, much of the web is built on spec. That means that, to say that somebody has a need, they have something they want to have built, and they'll assemble a team that will actually go and build it. And this tends to produce very traditional project dynamics. And you typically have a stakeholder and an implementation team where there's designers and developers. A lot of these roles overlap. You can have designers who know how to do development, and vice versa. You can have stakeholders that are involved in the design and so forth. But generally speaking, these are the sort of broad archetypes that I see an awful lot of as I'm doing my work. And even in this traditional business dynamic, if you bring up the context of accessibility, everybody likes it. Everybody knows somebody who's disabled in some way. Like I myself, my aunt is legally blind. My dad has limited mobility in his hands because of his rheumatoid arthritis, so using a keyboard and a mouse is a little problematic for him. And I have a friend who has a cognitive disability where she has a difficult time using a lot of software and the web because there's so much information coming at her that she can't focus on what she's trying to do and how the software is letting her do it. Just like I said, just about everybody knows somebody who's disabled in one way or another. And when you bring up the topic of accessibility, people like the idea of reaching a broader audience. People like the idea of doing something that's socially conscious and so forth. But the problem is that as you go through this, a lot of times the conversation starts to get way too abstract. People start wondering, well, what does accessibility mean? You know, is this something that's going to be a huge endeavor? What are we going to do about it? And they start throwing up roadblocks. And each individual group has a particular set of roadblocks that I see an awful lot of. For stakeholders, it's always concerned with budget and timeline. So they say, you know, we can't do this. It's going to be too expensive. We don't have the time for it. It's going to blow our timeline out of the water. Or another one that I hear a lot of is we don't need to be accessible. We're not the government, which I think, as we're all learning at this conference, that's not going to be true anymore for very long. We're all going to have to be accessible very soon here. And the other one is they're not our target audience. We're not selling to blind people or to deaf people or whatever, which is just sort of ableism in disguise of a business requirement. And then designers also have their own concerns about accessibility. They tend to worry about how accessibility is going to impact their creative process. So they're worried that if they have to produce something that's accessible, they won't be able to design an interaction or an experience that's compelling, that's beautiful, that's elegant. They're worried that it'll end up being boring and ugly, that they'll have to design to the least common denominator. I hear that phrase a lot. Let's see here, developers, guys like me, we have our own concerns about accessibility as well. We worry about the technological aspects, so we like to work with the latest technologies, and sometimes those technologies don't have the accessibility capabilities that we need. I'm kind of lucky as an HTML guy. Like, accessibility is built into what I do, so as long as I do my stuff right, I'm good to go. But I have a lot of colleagues at EffectiveUI who are very talented Flex developers, and they can produce accessible Flex applications, but they have to put a lot more effort into it than I do. Or we also worry about restricting our implementation. We also worry about timeline because it comes down to us to actually implement this stuff when the rubber hits the road. And as each of these groups talk about these things, they tend to start heterodyning off of each other. So as I talk about, you know, well, this is going to take longer, that freaks out the stakeholders, and then the stakeholders talk about, well, what about technology, and that freaks out the designers because they can't think they do anything, and it becomes a whole thing. So, but the truth of the matter is, you can do all of this. You can produce beautiful software with compelling interactions using the latest technology and not blow your budget or your timelines out of the water. The trick is to focus on details, to keep it real. By keeping it real, I mean focus on requirements early on in the process. You want to pick out what is relevant to your particular project. You want to pick out what standard you're particularly applying, whether it's Section 508 or WCAG, what level you're going for, how deep you're wanting to go in your project, and what's relevant as well. You use that to create achievable goals for how you're going to be doing your implementation and your design. And you also need to bear in mind, and this is something that's a little difficult to do at first, that not everything has to be perfect. You don't have to produce exactly the same interaction for everybody that you're going to be presenting to. It's just not necessary. When you keep it real, it helps the stakeholder by giving them the information that they need to be able to make the decisions that they're facing. It gives them the information about the investment that they're making, because a lot of times stakeholders are literally investing in a project. They're investing time or money or resources, and they need to know what the possible risks are for this investment and what returns they stand to gain for that. And it also helps them make their decisions for whether or not they want to invest in a particular aspect of accessibility. And it also provides transparency. Like I said, a lot of people don't understand what accessibility means. I mean, I think we're all experts here, and we kind of have a deeper understanding than the average person. And providing transparency into your accessibility implementation really helps these processes and even frees up roadblocks later on in the process. So you can have a stakeholder. I've had plenty of times where I've had a stakeholder who wasn't interested in accessibility at all, but we went ahead and started it. And then like halfway through the project, when they started to see results, they were like, this is really good, we need to do more. And so that's a great benefit there. It also helps the designers because it helps them understand that you're not trying to restrict their creative process, you're trying to support it. It lets them focus on what they actually need to do in the project at hand, whether it's making particular color palette choices or organization of data or whatever, and then they can move on from there and continue with being creative even in those situations. And for developers, it's obviously a big help for us because it gives us the information we need to make the technological decisions that we need to make, and we can make those early on in the process so that we know what we're going to be building with. It helps us define the constraints that we need to be working in so that we can produce our project plans and actually maintain a reasonable velocity as we're going through and doing our work. And it also gives us goals. Developers, a lot of developers like myself are really goal-oriented. We like to be able to do stuff. And it's really frustrating to do something and have your goalposts moved. So we like to be able to have these goals so we can demonstrate, yes, we did this. So a way I have found of actually implementing this idea is with this concept of progressive enhancement. Now, a lot of us have probably already heard of progressive enhancement in the context of actual development. It's something that I do all the time. I use progressive enhancement techniques, whether they're unobtrusive JavaScript or whatever. The idea of progressive enhancement is that you start off with this base experience or implementation, and depending upon what the user's capabilities are, you give them a different experience. So in a particular case for development, this is a good example, CSS3, which is a new standard that we're all working with. These are 3 screenshots of exactly the same code rendered in 3 different browsers. I'll do a close-up here. You can see the version in Chrome looks a lot better than the version in Internet Explorer 8. It's very simple stuff. There's just some rounded corners, some drop shadows, and some gradients. But stuff like that, we used to have to spend a lot of effort to actually make happen. And in this case, we can do it with just simple code, and it's a lot lighter. Internet Explorer 8's version isn't bad. It's perfectly fine. All of the stuff is there. All of the content is usable. All of it's there. It even looks pretty good. It's just not quite as pretty as what you see in Chrome. So the idea is you take this concept of progressive enhancement and the idea that your experience is dependent upon your capability and apply it to a larger context. So when you actually do that, you can start early on to help do all of the things that I was just talking about. So it helps you understand what your requirements are early on. Once you've decided what sort of standard you're applying, what level you're going to for that, it helps you start to create your audit trail. This is something that actually isn't necessarily a part of progressive enhancement, but it's something that I do as my best practices as I'm going through on these projects. At the end of a project, I like to demonstrate the decisions that we've made, why we've made them, how we've implemented them, and how we verified that they were implemented, so that at the end of a project we can deliver to the client or whoever. This is the level of accessibility that we're providing with this project. And it helps focus on specifics. So throughout the process, and most software processes go through a very specific 3 steps of define, design, and develop. Sometimes it's a waterfall process where one happens right after the other. Sometimes it's a more agile process where you're iterating inside of these things, but generally speaking, the steps are definition, design, and development. In the definition phase, progressive enhancement is where you're going to start using to apply to figure out your accessibility requirements. Like I said, what standard you're going to be using. You're going to start your audit trail. At this point, you would be explaining your decisions so that in the future you can demonstrate your efforts, and focus on your technological requirements early on in the process. This helps everybody, including the designers, understand the sort of constraints that they're going to be working under so that they can do what it is they need to do without having to revisit all of this stuff. It just becomes sort of part of the gestalt knowledge of the project. Then in the design process, it helps by what you do as part of your progressive enhancement concept is you maintain your audit trail for the relevant requirements. A lot of accessibility requirements are technological and not design in orient, but for the design stuff, you do need to indicate the choices that you've made, whether you've made a particular choice in color palette or, organization of information and so forth. Another thing that a lot of designers are afraid of when you start talking about progressive enhancement and this idea of graded support, where you have your experience is dependent upon your capability. They're worried that they have to produce multiple deliverables. They have to design every single thing that's going to be coming out, and that's not true. I found usually what is sufficient is to design the wireframes and the design comps for the richest experience, and then just notate somewhere, either in the files themselves or maybe in a separate document, the differences that are going to happen and the things that are going to be there and not there and so forth. So that helps free up the designers from actually having to do a lot of duplicate work for themselves. And then in the development process, obviously progressive enhancement comes a lot more into the foreground because we'll actually be applying progressive enhancement techniques, but we'll also maintain the audit trail, and this is where a lot of the auditing will happen. We'll actually be implementing the requirements and so forth. And then we will use this audit trail as a basis for our QA. So a lot of times once you're done building stuff, you hand it off to a team to actually test and make sure that what you said you built, you actually built. And this gives them a nice setup document all ready to go with test cases and everything that they can use to do their work. And it really helps support that process towards the end. So I'd like to talk about a real life example at this point. Let's see here. About a year ago, we were approached by Microsoft to do a new website for the United States Navy's flight demonstration team, otherwise known as the Blue Angels. We wanted to use Silverlight and HTML5 to sort of showcase those new technologies and what they were capable of while providing the squadron with a really good and rich interaction that sort of immerses the users in it and so forth. So the first thing that we did is we built what we call a vision demo. A vision demo is basically a video where we sort of animate in and show sort of at a high level what we would really like to do with the project and what we think would be cool and all of the stuff that we'd like to try and stuff like that. And needless to say, when we showed this to the Blue Angels, they thought it was pretty cool. But one of the first questions that they asked us is, can you guys do something like this and make it accessible? And because as part of the Navy, everything they do has to be 508 compliant. So we had to think about that throughout this project. We had this beautiful vision demo that sort of promised the sky and see if we could actually do it. So early on in the process, we started off by defining what it is we were going to be doing as far as the standards we were going to be following. In our case, it was Section 508, which is not really very restrictive as far as this stuff goes. It's not hard to actually make stuff 508 compliant if you just try a little harder. And so we started off with that. It helped us guide the design. So this design here in particular isn't 508 compliant. There's some contrast issues. There's some organizational issues and so forth. So it helped us move forward from this vision demo into a real life design. So what I'm going to show you now are actual pages from this site. This is a work in progress. So you're going to see some placeholder content. You're going to see some stuff that isn't quite done yet, so bear with me through that. But these are actual rendered pages out of the application. So you can see here on the home page, we have the image in the background. We're actually in the process of replacing that with an HTML5 video like we had in the Vision demo. So we'll have a video of a walk down, which is where the pilots walk down the tarmac and peel off one by one and go into their aircraft. We'll have that in the background. There's the standard feeds for like Twitter and for latest news and stuff like that. Right now, those are implemented in Silverlight, but we are changing those to be implemented in HTML5 because that will make them more accessible. So if you look at the base experience that we have here, this is basically what you will see if you turn off CSS and JavaScript in your browser. And you can see right now there's not a whole heck of a lot on there because the two widgets, the news and the Twitter widgets, are not actually implemented in HTML5 yet, so they're not actually there. But they will be. And all of the information in them will be accessible. So basically all that's on this right now is just the links to the rest of the site. And so I will show you this next page. This is an example of a sort of combination page. So there's a good amount of text on here. There's also some video in the upper right-hand corner there. And beneath the video there, you can see there's an image gallery. And then on the other side of that, there's links to the various subsections of this area of the site, you know, the officers, the enlisted team, and so forth. So we had this design that was really beautiful and had great interactions. If you actually click on the gallery there, you get an in-place pop-up where you could actually scroll through the images one at a time and flip back and forth through them. It's a beautiful interaction. So in order to make that accessible, what we had to do was start off with just base HTML markup. It's very straightforward markup. It's semantic. And then we enhanced it with HTML, with CSS and JavaScript to actually grab onto the existing content. If we were able to scroll down a little bit lower, I could show you that you could see all of the images in the gallery and all of their captions. It's all there. It's all available for anybody who wants to enjoy it. But we were able to grab onto it and produce a much richer experience for the people who have that capability. And also, we have at the very top there, we have a skip to content link. That's not part of 508, but that's sort of a best practice that's a good idea so that you can skip past repetitive navigation. If you're using a screen reader or something like that, it helps speed things up. Now, speaking to the concept of not everything has to be perfect, the next two slides I'm going to show you are examples of very rich interactions that were very difficult to come up with anything for a base interaction. So in this case, you have the inside the demo page. The deal with this is as the Blue Angels go through their demonstration, they follow this list of maneuvers that they go through. You can see that list of maneuvers on the left there. And they have a lot of existing content that they've already taken as part of these demos. So they have camera angles from a lot of different angles. They have camera angles from the ground. They have camera angles from wingtip cameras. They have camera angles from cockpit cameras and helmet cameras. So we were able to actually take their maneuver list and produce this sort of integrated video environment where you can see the maneuver as it goes through, and all of these views are synchronized. And you can see all of these different views as they go through the maneuvers. And at the bottom there, there's an animated version that shows the aircraft as they actually move through the animation, or move through the maneuver, so that you can see it sort of from a distance in a more graphic fashion. Now on this, you can see we're actually using Silverlight's closed captioning capabilities. Silverlight has a lot of pretty good assistive technology capabilities built into it from a raw state. Microsoft, I think, really had that in mind when they were building this stuff. So we were able to use that right off by just producing some basic closed captioning, because we actually have, as part of the audio for this page, the comm chatter, what the guys are saying to each other as they're going through their maneuvers. So we were able to do that. And then there's also the regular narration of explaining what the maneuver is and so forth. But for this page, because it's so heavy visually, there's not a whole heck of a lot here that we could do for a basic experience. If we were able to do something here that we haven't done, it would probably be to link off to the closed captioning, just so that people can actually read that as a static file. Right now, I think we have it embedded directly in the Silverlight. I'm not sure exactly what the deal is with that, but But you can see there's not a whole heck of a lot on here that that's really accessible. And at first we had a difficult time of getting past that, of like, well, we can't build ourselves the nice inside the demo page because we can't make it accessible. We can't make it something that everybody can enjoy. And once we freed ourselves from the concept that, you know, not everything doesn't have to be perfect, we were actually able to move forward and actually produce something pretty good. So this is another example of that same concept. This is the aircraft page. Right now, this is all done in Silverlight. You can actually rotate through the aircraft, and there are hot spots that you can click on. I've opened one about the smoke tank, and you can interact with the aircraft and so forth. Right now, this is done in Silverlight. I actually talked with one of our 3D animators a couple of weeks ago, and we figured out a way to do it in HTML5. Now, I don't know if we're going to have time to do it in HTML5 because we have our goal, we hope, to have this released sometime beginning, middle of December. So I don't know that we have enough time to actually redo this in HTML5, but if we did, that would make it a little bit more accessible because we would be able to have more images that other people could actually enjoy. But right now it's done in Silverlight. So as an example of the base experience, again, not a whole heck of a lot there. On the other side of the spectrum, this is an example of a really information-rich part of the page, or part of the site. So this has their schedule, this has the Blue Angels schedule, it's got some downloadable stuff that you can get. Like if you want to have the Blue Angels come to your air show, you can download the application and so forth. This was actually really easy to make, because this is something that HTML is really good at. This was actually really easy to make accessible. Here we're using HTML5's new microformats capabilities to actually format those dates so that when Google and other web crawlers actually parse this information and display it in search results, you'll get nice little calendars next to each of these entries and so forth. It also helps with assistive technologies because it's that much more semantic information. It's not just a list of dates. You're actually indicating that these are actual dates and places that are associated with them, and that really helps the assistive technologies too. So, like I said, we were able to do all of this, and we produced for ourselves an audit document where we started from the very beginning. We indicated the choices that we were making. We indicated how we'd implemented them, built test cases for it, and so forth. And we have that as well. And so we were able to actually produce this really rich experience without totally blowing everything up or having the project go off the rails or anything like that. We had other timeline issues with the project. They were mostly related to really wanting to push the design, and so we went through several design revisions, but it wasn't a problem with accessibility. We didn't have a problem with that with this stuff. So that actually brings me sort of to the end of what I had here. Did anybody have any questions about this?
In the development process for those, for example, for those pages,
Yes.
you said that you sort of spec the richest experience. But somewhere in there, it almost sounded like you started from the HTML for the minimalist.
Yep. In the really what it comes down to when you're actually building your HTML is you know what the content is you're going to be putting in there somehow, and what the real basis, the HTML is really the framework that everything hangs off of. So it really is pretty much the first thing that you build. So when we actually built those pages, the first thing we did was actually build out the HTML and then come up with the CSS to lay it out nicely, and then move on from there for adding in interactions and the richer stuff like the Silverlight and so forth. So yeah, we did actually, you're actually correct about that. We did actually start off with the HTML from the start. Yes?
I think if you use HTML5 for introduction.
Yes, we do.
How do you deal with grading and
So obviously, we can't use any of the fancy new HTML5 stuff. You know, the data storage stuff is pretty limited. The audio and video tags are not supported by Internet Explorer yet, and so forth. So we have to bear that in mind. But you can manage those you can manage those degradations with progressive enhancement. So, like for instance, there are several projects out there for the HTML5 video tag that have fallbacks to Flash, so that you can actually display the content if you don't have an HTML5 capable browser, and they're actually very nice. they work very well. Microsoft is going to be having Internet Explorer 9 out, which is going to be HTML5 compliant, and that should be out. The rumors that I've heard are the beginning of next year. I was hoping it would come out before Christmas as a Christmas present for me, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be the beginning of next year before it comes out. But I would rather have them put it out later and do a good job than rush it out and have it be kind of broken in some ways, because Lord knows that's been a thorn in my side all my career. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. So the answer to the first question, what is the typeface I use there? I don't actually remember. This is sort of a standard basic slide template, and I actually had one of the designers help me out with it because I don't really have much of a design sensibility myself for creating stuff out of whole cloth. I can look it up in a second here when we stop it, but I don't actually remember what it was off the top of my head. So as for the second question, which was, it sounded like we had built in accessibility after the fact, which actually isn't quite true. That wasn't what I had meant to indicate. We started off from the very beginning considering accessibility from the start. We knew what standard we needed to apply, what we needed to do. We knew what level we were going to be going to, so we knew our constraints right away. And so it was just baked into the process. It wasn't something that we had to go back and retcon in after the fact, which is why it worked so well. And that's really the secret to this. You have to start off with your accessibility requirements very early in the process so that you know how to design for it and how to build for it. Any other questions? Yes, sir. So that's another example of progressive enhancement for that. The Blue Angels have very specific design requirements. They have a brand that they have to maintain. And so what we did there is we produced a lot of that text as graphics. I can actually show you here an example. I believe on this page has a good example. So yeah, you can see like the show information and schedule is in the Blue Angels preferred font, but we used a progressive enhancement technique called image replacement, where basically underneath that there's the text, and then we just replace it with images using CSS to actually sort of push the text out of the way and replace it with a graphic. So that's how we handled that. That means that if we were to hook this up, for example, to a content management system, there would be problems because CMS doesn't let you change graphics; it just lets you change text. But that wasn't one of the situations for this. Some of this stuff is meant to work with content management systems, like the team biographies are all drawn out of an XML file, which presumably could later on be hooked up to a content management system. And as long as they maintained the correct markup, they would work just fine in what we've currently designed. Yes, sir. It is quite a big thing, and what we had to do is ask ourselves, so if we were going to be providing that kind of a rich interaction for a visual audience, a visually capable audience, what would we be able to provide for somebody who was just using a screen reading experience? And the answer was, at least the 2 pages that I showed you, not much. There's not a whole heck of a lot available there. So that's kind of why it looked like that, and that's why I wanted to show that as an example of why it's not necessary to actually be perfect there. We could have done something a little less interactive and then been more accessible that way, and sort of met a little more towards the middle. And I think there is even room for improvement there, even without degrading our current rich interaction. Like I said, for the aircraft page, we thought of a way of doing it using HTML5 and CSS3 animations. So we might actually be able to do that in the future if we have time. We're hoping to, but we don't know. So. Exactly, and so for that we rely on Silverlight's actual built-in accessibility capabilities. So I'm not really sure how most screen readers react to Silverlight, probably not very well, but Silverlight does have the sort of innate capability of being able to handle that stuff. So if you have a screen reader that has the capability of playing audio, it can do that for you. So that's how we were sort of relying on that. It wasn't shown. It's not shown in this because this is just just the HTML markup. There's no CSS or JavaScript for that, so it wasn't. We weren't really showing that. So, question. Yep. Yep. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. It was great.